So, let us get started. As many of you have seen, I'm adopting a more minimalist style of introduction. So let me just welcome Benjamin Bratton to to initiate the second phase of this June session as we go into topic of time, and which you'll be touching upon, I suppose, fairly directly tonight with a presentation on Virilio. I just want to say one thing about Ben. Some of you may not know that he is the program director at the New Normal program at the Strelka Institute. So he's coming to us from Moscow. Normally he comes to us from San Diego or some place, but currently his home base, right now anyway, is Moscow. And
well, home base is still California.
Well, yes, but I meant just...
My embassy is
embassy
is in Moscow.
Anyway, I mentioned this because I urge you to check that out on the web. It's a very interesting program.
Indeed.
And with that, let me also welcome the people who are joining us by live stream, and let us begin.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks. Thank you all for coming. It's always a sort of annual treat to come here to SOSFE to EGS. It's several few years in a row now, and it's always it's a sort of important part of my annual migration circuit, sort of to come back here and to kind of and to check in. And for those of you who are in my seminar this year, know that one of the things I like to do with the seminars here is to kind of try out new material, play some new songs, and see what works and what. And so, thank you for participating in this collaboration, I suppose. The talk that I prepared this evening also, in a way, tries to specifically link back to EGS in another way, and that is it's about a particular former faculty member of EGS named Paul Virilio, who passed away a few years ago, was a political theorist, social theorist, an architect, former director of École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris, and someone who had a pretty strong influence on my own thinking, my own writing in one way or another, but maybe in a kind of upside down way, which I'll talk to and speak to in a little bit. In that, someone who influenced me by I'll sort of get to part of what I would like to the argument I'll sort of make, and I'll sort of cut right to the chase at the beginning and then work backwards from there, is to argue that despite of all this, Virilio was, in his own way, a kind of flat earther. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a way. So, I also had the privilege to write the introduction to the new edition of the English translation of one of his key works, Speed and Politics, published by Semiotext. And I'll just read quickly some of the one sort of key passage from this, which will also serve as a bit of an introduction to Virilio's work for those of you who might not be as familiar with it as you'd like. And it goes like this: Virilio's modernity is logistical. It doesn't directly deal with war, but with everything that makes it possible. Logistics is, for Virilio, the preparation for war through the transfer of the nation's potential to its armed forces in time of peace as in times of war. Modernity is a world in motion, expressed in translations of strategic space into logistical time and back again. It is a history of cities, of partitions, trading circuits, satellites, and software, of a political landscape governed by competing technologies of surveillance, mobilization, fortification, and their interdependent administrations. It begins, for Virilio, as an archaeology of naval routes, strategic techniques, and urban distributions, and becomes an integrated world of events reduced to shapes and symbols, viewed and manipulated instantaneously on screens. In Virilio's narrative, architectural regimes thus become computational and vice versa. I go on, quoting myself. Both are Both of these, the architectural and the computational, are logistical media for mobilization and its administration. Technologies that consolidate territory into logistical fields and enable a modern governance based on the abstracted calculation over omnidirectional spaces and surfaces, from open oceans to shared spreadsheets. This comprehensive technologization of the globe signals for Virilio both integration and disintegration, both control and accident. And it is finally through the accident, the realization of the imminent irreducible risk that logistics hopes to contain, and not through control, that the strongest bonds of the polis are formed. For Virilio, they, the accidents, are the exceptional condition already contained within and rigorously predicted by the invention that made them possible. I'm referring to his sort of famous axiom that the invention of any new technology is also simultaneously the invention of a new kind of accident. That the invention of the car is the invention of the car crash. The invention of the stock market is the invention of the stock market crash. The accident is not, in fact, so accidental after all. And so, in ways that, based on this, my summary of this, it should be clear that this line of thought had a strong resonance with some of the work in the stack, in that it was looking at the combination of hard and soft architectural partitions and subdivisions and the way in which they produce access and prevent access to urban space. But in their weird generic cosmopolitanism of sorts, their comprehensiveness, they may also provide for forms of accidental integration, a different kind of accidental cosmopolitanism, one derived not from parliamentary certificates and legal credentials, but for an actual shared physical relationship to a ubiquitous infrastructure. Touch point by touch point, the city layer is perhaps where the birth pangs of the stack geopolitics are felt most viscerally. The arrival of any political constitution is accompanied often by some corresponding foundational violence, a constitutional violence. And this is no less true of planetary scale computation and the jurisdictions emerging in its interfacial networks. Now, in my seminar this morning, I was joking with my students about an interview that I had given a couple months ago with a Chinese journalist who was interrupting me a few times. He was asking me these questions like, I apologize, I don't mean to be Satan's lawyer, but could you explain this point a little bit more clearly? And he said this about 3 or 4 times, and I finally realized that what he meant was devil's advocate. But allow me to be in a motion to be Satan's lawyer for a moment. In his introduction to the interviews, his second of the interview books with Virilio, Sylvain Lautringer, the editor of Semiotext, makes the point rather directly that Virilio, despite his apparent sort of obsession with technology, as really Sylvain puts it, Virilio actually hates technology with a passion, quote unquote. But that this absolute rejection of technology could also be experienced as a form of love or devotion. And of course, Virilio himself, sort of a bit of biography, was himself a bit claustrophobic, never traveled anywhere. He had his own peculiar kind of spatial phobias. So I just want to come clean. I read Virilio, in this sense, a bit backwards, in that, like the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch that were meant to try to convince people not to want to go to hell, but actually in a way made hell a kind of interesting proposition. The way in which what Virilio describes as the worst possible things in the world, I was, since I was young, was quite intrigued by. And so there was my interest in his descriptions is a bit purient, I want to say. And so I'm trying to read him a bit, understand what he started describing as the worst thing in the world. I see perhaps as something not so bad after all. Now, One way in which we might want to enter into this then has to do with is asking about the possible arrangements or relationships between politics and technology, the political and the technological in Berlioz's model, and its limitations there, and perhaps as a way of opening up again what these terms might actually even mean at this point. We would, I think, posit here at this point that politics is always produced in and by a particular technical milieu. The possibility of the organization of a polity or how a polity would inscribe itself and model itself and enforce itself never takes place outside of the technical possibilities of this mediation. And at least in this sense, the differentiation of the political from the technical is a bit of a fiction. Technology is, of course, produced and circumscribed by political condition. But what's of interest to us maybe then is how the boundary of each is constantly put into question in this oscillation and feedback between the two, as well. This is, I think, a rather different approach in comparison to, for example, Carl Schmittian decisionism, and this sort of more of a metaphysical conceptualization of the political as an autonomous realm. That is, the first decision is not, and I'm assuming a bit of familiarity with Schmitt's notion of the sovereign, the first decision before the decision of the exception is the decision of what is even inside or outside the polity in the first place, over which this sovereignty might rule. So, advocates of what we might call the strong program of the political, capital T, capital P, such as Schmitt, who I'll talk a little bit about a little bit later on, and the tradition of a kind of the agonistic capital P politics that follows from it on both the left and the right. We see, Chantal Mouffe, for example, sort of using this strong version of the political as this autonomous realm, actually can't well approach this mutual nested entanglement of the political and the technical through this arrangement, in that it presupposes a kind of autonomy for the political that and probably doesn't really exist. And so in these such terms, then, the political is not then just the exclusion of us and them, friend and enemy, in the Schmittian model, or the human from animal, and as Agamben draws it out, but also of the exclusion of the polity from oikos, the political from the economic, polity from technics, technics from mythos, etc., etc. That these decisions and these blurry boundaries are always one that ultimately these buttresses never actually hold. And I think one of the interesting things about Berlioz's work is that he always, I think, started with an understanding of this, the promiscuous entanglements of this, and understood that one may not necessarily always precede the other or subordinate the other, the political and the technological. So, if we, as opposed to the sort of formal theory of the political then, if we imagine this, another sort of entry point into this in relation to a kind of, for example, kind of base to superstructure dynamic, for example, this maybe provides another second scenario in which we could maybe try to locate Berlioz's relation of the political and technological. And perhaps I think it could work in at least one of two ways. One is that war is politics that is channeled by a maximal expression of the technologies of abstraction. It is politics channeled through this maximal expression, technology expression, that politics in its most extreme sense expresses itself as sort of war. Or the two, that the technologies of spatial and temporal abstraction themselves are war, for which politics is merely a kind of theatrical after effect. I think there's different ways in which we might see his work in both of these, and I'll try to undermine both possibilities in my own way. Now, the topic then of this relation of the, more specifically of the relation of the spatial machinations at work here, the spatial technologies and their discontents, if you like, is the figure of the horizon and its own sort of architectures. And I'll use the horizon as a more specific and technical term, but also as a stand-in for a variety of sort of anxieties of space, spatial anxiety, or the generalized claustrophobia, that for Virilio is read through the technologies, through various kinds of technologies of spatial and temporal abstraction. Now, the horizon as a term, as a word, as a master concept, shows up quite a lot in Virilio's work, not only in the book Negative Horizon, but throughout, from bunker archaeology to Speed and Politics through to some of the later work. And in each of the times it's brought up, it's mentioned at one point, I think, usually is meant both as a technical measure, like the horizon is such, and it's measurable, it exists, it has a sort of grounding function, but also as an allegory for a kind of natural perceptual order that has been or is being distorted or deranged by mediating technologies of abstraction. That it is the horizon that is the victim, is that which is it is the ground that is put into question by these technologies. Now, to be direct, the argument I will make is that this derangement of the horizon, its denaturalization of the horizon, is not a distorting of a natural order, but rather the revealing that this apparent intuitive order was a synthetic condition. The technology, one of the accidents of the technologies of abstraction is, one of the accidents of this technology of abstraction is the disenchantment of this natural order of the horizon. That all horizons are false horizons in this regard. And so, even while anxieties about new technologies in particular are expressed often in accounts of its pernicious effects or potential pernicious effects, this unease may actually be rooted not in what a new technology actually does, but rather in what it reveals that was there and true all along, that we would rather not know. Microscopes, as we say, do not cause microbes, but once we know that they're there, we never see surfaces in the same way again. And these unrequested demystifications are disturbing, especially when they in some way demote us from our place of presumed privilege or centrality or intuitive natural stability. The contemporary art of anxiety, for example, is perhaps concern about the disturbance of certain kinds of human-shaped subjects more than others. And the elision of subjects may be fine if it is spread by a kind of somber and nervous notion of the world as text, or if it clears ways for a different kind of post-secular arrangement. However, the horizon, of course, as we know, is an illusion of our intuition. It's an illusion of ground. It is an artifact of a particular perceptual position, both in perceptual reality and also as allegory. It feels like a grounding orientation and has been used as one to naval navigation and so forth. But if it is, that is because it is always vanishing. And so, the focus for Virilio, more specifically, is perhaps not so much the political as such, but rather the perceptual, corporeal, temporal. And it is this temporal order, guaranteed by the spatial order of the grounded horizon, that is that which speed, the real enemy within the Virillian cosmology, this is what speed deranges. What speed annihilates is this spatial and temporal natural order. But in this, we're talking about speed, in this question of speed, is this acceleration the view of someone standing still and watching the world churn by so fast? Or is it the view of someone who is, him or herself, actually accelerating just to keep up or in relation to the perceiving ground as it swims by? In many ways, or rather directly, I think what scandalizes Virilio the most is this loss of the world of intuitive corporeal appearances, the world in its apparentness. The space that disappeared, that he chronicled the aesthetics of its disappearance, however, was unreal. It was an illusion. It was not only a European space, it was, in its way, a superstitious space. Just as the sky is not actually up, the sky is not actually blue, if your visual is only blue because our visual cortex evolved in a certain way, and so forth and so on. And so, at least in this way, the grounded primacy of the horizon is a flat Earth take. But flatness is not the only point. The ordering of perception is managed, ultimately, supervised by a kind of, by the conception of a proper arrangement of scales, sometimes called proportion, which is an aesthetic feat as much as a mathematical one. How do I mean? Well, let me give you an example. In 1977, a film you're probably well familiar with, IBM commissioned a film called Powers of 10, or on the order of scales in the universe, by Charles and Ray Eames, which demonstrates a tunneling trip through a smooth universe, taking the viewer from 10 to the negative 6 meters, the size of quarks and a proton, to 10 to the 24 meters, the size of the known visible universe, in 1977. The film's cosmic zoom is well known to every design student, introduced to the aesthetics of nested complexity at usually an impressionable age. And so, while it would be stupid to criticize a 9-minute film for incompletely summarizing the tension of spatial relations between the atomic and astronomic scales, its aesthetics is perhaps fair game. Now, in the smooth continuity of its zoom, the threshold seams between scales are marked only by these sequential index notations. This is a universe in which the, quote, relative size of things, per the film's subtitle, is identical with the physical continuity and discontinuity of matter at different scales. This is a world in which Leibniz's monadic ponds grow, a magical place where the mass-to-body ratio of insects has no bearing on their ability to jump or survive a fall, for example, and where the principles of nanoengineering are the same as for car repair. Another aesthetic demonstration is required, one that includes scale variance as a profound and critical absolute. As each scale is regularly irregular to the others that it situates, the feedback recursion across scales is a force that occupies them. Variance is not just what crosses out the generic articulation of a dynamic spatial model, it's in fact what that model is and does. The film famously begins from a strange place. The chosen cosmic center of center is a park in Chicago, where a man and a woman sleep on a blanket on the grass. Telescoping into this universal frozen moment entails passing through and indeed into the man's hand. On the one hand, the suggestion is that the nested scales and spaces could be anywhere, even in your hand as you look down at it right now. On the other, it is a kind of adamant demonstration of a universe arranged not for a subjectless abstraction, but for a single subjective point that happens to be literally inside a human's own person. Like this man, we, the viewers, are also the measure against which metering scales are either positive or negative. And here, the anthropometric privilege is the address of the Goldilocks zone between what is large and what is small. The horizon is for him the arrangement of things that planetary media would derange is a natural perceptual order that radiates and recedes around him, indeed within him. But that position of all positions is itself contingently nested, not just within other scales that it anchors. And this is the deranged notion. The physics of scale as such, works only, of course, in relation to others. The anthropometric position is also hardly immune to this scale variance, even if it confuses that variance's surface aesthetics with its more profound operations. Variance not only shifts from one threshold to the next along a striated scalar gradient, different scales, macro to micro, are interlocked in counterintuitive feedback recursions, and so cannot map so easily onto fixed local and global perspectives. Emergent effects leapfrog thresholds as a matter of course along equally inhuman rhythms and tempos that cannot be captured by the Eames' lovely synchronic zoom. Some forms of spatial reasoning, stepping back from the Eames for a moment, some forms of spatial reasoning, quote, encode the location of objects at whatever scale in a displayed relation to a perceiving self. This sort of mapping we call egocentric models of mapping, where something is in relation to me. Whereas others locate objects at whatever scale in relation to other objects, as for some perceiving self is set in a kind of alienated relation to these as yet, him or herself as yet another object in this field. Allocentric mapping, like the dot of you on the map on Google Maps. And we switch between these all the time, such as when we follow map directions while driving, alternating between a narrative point of view shot, turn left, turn right, and or reading a live satellite image by following the dot that is you along a path, and back again, back and forth. In short, Powers of 10 is an egocentric model of nested scalar relationships that aspires to be not just an allocentric model, but indeed a xenocentric model, the alien perspective, but it is not. Like that contemporary art and scholarship of anxiety, it seeks to critique the human and humanist subject position, but does so by making the world into another sort of text for that subject by offering its fixed narrative of scale. A narrative, a text for whom? How is this nested complexity rendered as a story, if not for that hollow center of the anthropometric referent? Now, which brings me, of course, to Carl Schmitt. A super problematic character, as they say. So one of the notions from Schmitt that we will make use of here in relation to Virilio is that of the nomos. Nomos is a term that appears, a book from Schmitt 1950, The Nomos of the Earth. It was a history of the logics of political geography and the structural jurisdictional domains by which a geopolitical order ensues. The notion of nomos for Schmitt refers to both the abstract logic by which a world might be subdivided. We're going to divide the land but not the sea, the land but not the air, the geometry, if you like, and logic of subdivision, and the fundamental, for Schmitt, inscriptions made in the ground that would make these differentiations of interior and exterior, and the geopolitical order that ensues from this sequence, that which cleaves inside from outside and produces a kind of stability of exclusive insides and outsides one from another. And as I say, the geopolitical order that emerges from from these kinds of subdivisions. He writes, modern state polities are defined as interior to their own circumscribing geographic partition, and their sovereignty is produced in the fragile image of that line's stability, even as that line remains in principle reversible. That is, what is inside and what is outside might be flipped way or another, in the same way that, are you inside the fence or is the fence keeping you in? Right? Is this a bunker or an enclave? Are you keeping something out or are you being kept in? This is always reversible, and the decision of what is the inside and the outside is among the decisions that the line gives, that is one of the sovereign decisions that the line produces. Now, as I talked about in the stack, the particular model of the nomos that Schmitt recommends, and I think that Virilio subscribes to rather emphatically, is one of the primacy of ground and of land. And so this gives way to a particular, as I talked about in the book, gives way to a particular kind of Westphalian geopolitical order by which land is subdivided, not the sea, not the air, but land. And you get a kind of Westphalian, what we call a Westphalian geometry. The modern nation state is itself a function of a particular cartographic projection that conceives of the earth as a horizontal plane filled with various allotments of land in which individual sovereign domains are circumscribed by jagged lines. All of these shapes then are derived from this basic topology of loops. That this order is a loop topology, a geometry that becomes a geography. And it is not, of course, the only option that we have. Now, as Schmidt took pains to elaborate, the importance of the grounded subdivision of land versus the more promiscuous occupation of the open glacial space of the ocean was something that put the stability of the geopolitical order in question. And so his strong distinction between what he saw as the proper, essentially proper Germanic occupation of land versus the more fragile Anglo abstraction of the sea in this movement was a kind of fundamental tension that of which we would sort of see that it's not in fact then a nomos based on the subdivision of the sea, as we would say the British wanted to make. In the British model, the sea would be owned by no one. The French would be owned by everyone. For the Spanish, it would be owned by the Spanish, and so forth and so on. But the differences are clear. But it's this land versus sea model. There's the ground versus which for Schmidt was a kind of groundedness versus a mathematized abstraction of space, which links it to all sorts of matter of other forms of abstraction, financialization, so forth and so on in Schmidt's model, that we'll see so many echoes in the way Virilio deals with the same question. Now, more recently, we not only subdivide land and sea, we subdivide the electromagnetic spectrum, for example. And so, in our contemporary moment, the nomos is not just, the question of what is the nomos of our geopolitics is not just one that can be answered so easily between land versus sea. It's also many other things, and it's also both at once. And of course, as we know, that stable Westphalian order never really held. It was always bedeviled by its own exceptions of enclaves and exclaves and so forth and so on, that the lines were always fuzzy, always breaking, the inside from the outside always in question. And so at this moment, I would suggest, where we find ourselves is not so much one of a dissipation or disappearance of borders, but rather an exponential multiplication of lines, of segmentation within segmentation upon segmentation, not within one single overarching master's nomic system, but the simultaneous occupation of the same site and the same process as named and addressed and organized by multiple competing nomic orders that sometimes don't even recognize their proximity to other ones, which produces, in this multiplication of lines, and also a multiplication of exceptions and zones of exception and strange pockets of things that are both inside and outside in different ways, such as the various political and economic exception zones, as they're called, which are not smooth, they're highly striated, but which of course makes them more interesting in how these exceptions mediate our political and technical power at this time. Not because they aren't bordered, but because they're so borderless, but rather because this striation, this highly intensified striation, gives them this kind of charge, such that perhaps many of the structure and development and conjugation of these exceptional zones has in fact become more normal. the political exceptional zone, the economic exceptional zone, is no longer an exceptional strategy. It's in fact a normal strategy of building the gaps into the system in this way. Now, so, as I discussed, the book loops give way to another kind of topology, another kind of geography, not one of which is one of, in a way, multiple totalities, all layered on top of another. Not one final last instant sovereignty, but multiple totalities, some state-based, some extra-state-based, some global, some regional, some modern, some archaic, all claiming the same site or person, a bit of data, all at once. So our gnomic order is not only, what I mean to say is the level of convolution and promiscuity and strange procedures that define our geopolitical gnomic order are ones that for sure would have scandalized our friend Mr. Schmidt. It's worse than he ever could have imagined, in other words. Now, the reaction to all of this is rather different and perhaps kind of predictable. In a certain valence of the populist political reactionary imaginary, this struggle between what within this Schmittian discourse is called the struggle between eternal Rome versus eternal Carthage. The struggle between the supposedly eternal struggle between the grounded empires versus the naval empires, between the truly grounded versus the promiscuous abstraction. That is, authentic institutions of land versus inauthentic empires of the abstracted sea and air and atmosphere. And the ways these form within this discourse, the respective templates of Eurasian versus Atlantic models, orients itself according to different axes than the traditional left-right division. That is, this dynamic of the ground versus the abstraction animates both. We see this both in both the left and the right, and it is certainly a trope that is held in central esteem by both Schmidt and Berlioz. Including for, okay, so as one of my Stroka students, Lukas Likavčan, from a Slovenian philosopher, put it, by both relocalizing multipolar imaginations of the Eurasian model and the globalist Atlantic models are actually different versions of the same appeal to a certain kind of grounded interiority. So in Russia, where I spend a fair bit of time, this notion of the Rome versus Carthage, land versus sea, ground versus abstraction, tradition versus the global, is a trope, a discourse in full force. The valor of indigeneity of place and natural horizon is claimed forcefully by, for example, right-wing writers such as Alexander Dugin, seen here, as an explicitly anti-modern, anti-Western bulwark on behalf of a Eurasian traditionalism, capital E, capital T. Dugin, as you know, is a sometimes Putin whisperer, or at least another weird Surkov project, an avid evangelist of Heidegger and Schmidt in his own weird way, and writes extensively on how much inspiration is to be taken from both Heidegger and Schmidt from the grounded anti-modernism and this air-sea ground versus dynamic relationship. And so, ground as capital G ground and ground as surface, as the basis of this natural structure of horizon, are related, but of course not really the same. And I don't mean to conflate them too neatly. But they both do enforce Berlioz's architecture rather directly. As I said, Berlioz was also an architect. So as he was a child of World War II. His sort of repeats as often as possible the formative experiences of the shelling and the violence of the war. These are some of the bunkers the Germans built in Normandy along the north of France in which to repel the invasion, which was an area, a design and a figuration of deep groundedness, the antithesis of mobilization, the antithesis of speed, that was very influential on young Berlioz. And so when he became an architect, collaborating with Claude Parent, we see this influence rather strikingly in his work. Something this is not like an obscure interpretation. He will evangelize this point. This is the church at Saint Bernadette, collaboration between Virilio and Parent. There's another close-up of Saint Bernadette. The obvious influence of the bunkers of Normandy should be clear. Now, the other, Virilio and Parent worked together for a few years. Parent went on to have his own career. Virilio, as I said, became director of the École Spéciale d'Architecture after 68. In addition to these few built works, one of the other things that this practice was known for was an architectural investigation of the oblique, the diagonal, which was a different kind of architecture, a different kind of urbanism more precisely, that was interested in the arrangements and governance of movement and circulation and mobilization. And for Virilio here, as in his theoretical work, the primary mechanism of social transformation is relative motility, of circulation, and it's including its acceleration or deacceleration, its enablement or prevention. And so even as stasis in its own way had become a product of speed, the job of architecture, or of urbanism more specifically for them, was to modulate movement. Not necessarily to accelerate, but also to sort of slow it down. And so, like for Schmidt perhaps, the fundamental inscription of space, the basic grammar of the design is the obstacle. And since here we have a kind of logic of the horizon taken to a figural extreme. Quoting from Virilio about the oblique, the idea is that the floor is both furniture and building. This infinite horizontal plane that can bend and fold and percolate in other kinds of structured ways, but it never finally, but it still retains its supervisory function. He goes on. The floor is the surface that contains the entire life of the house. Think of this endless horizontal plane, literally to the horizon. Encasements, furniture, television, TV. TV is an object that you watch between your legs. You practically step on it. It's like a pool or an aquarium. As with planetary reality, it is the ground that contains life. Unquote. Now, the logic of ground is, of course, taken up by architecture in any number of different ways. The dominant logic of the sectional view for Mies van der Rohe, for example, is taken for granted. But here, the choreography of occupation is about nested volumes, including nested volumes of relative opacity and transparency, not about motility and tilt, and about mobilization. It's about a diagrammatic structure of program and an efficiency and minimalist efficiency of form, rather than the perception, rather than a kind of a perceptual horizon, infinite. Now, it is also for Virilio and Parent's model in this furniture habitat dynamic, and in many ways we think that in any sort of structure, this dynamic between which kinds of programmatic functions are undertaken by furniture and which ones by architecture is always a bit of give and take. Anything that furniture could do, you could build into the architecture. Anything architecture could do, you could make into furniture. You can, absolute modularization. For Virilio, in a way, making all architecture into furniture also implies an absolute zero modularity, where everything is sort of fixed and organized in place. It's a war on furniture, if you like. Here's a built example of some of the oblique work. Here, the natural dynamic of the situation really concludes: we will achieve what social theories have failed to accomplish, the invention of a new society through this immanent architecture as well. Now, like most interesting, sort of experimental architectures of the 1960s, it was unbuilt by the designers and ended up getting built later by other anonymous interests. Hong Kong probably being the city that is actually the more direct expression of their urbanism of the diagonal and the oblique for other kinds of purposes as well. Now, let me speak then to this question of the body's relationship to architecture and why I think that there's not only in relation to the horizon, but also just in relationship to the technical, that there's a different kind of fundamental misapprehension in his approach. Virilio and his group explicitly looked for more permanent ways of, quote, freeing the body from the multiple prostheses, from cars to elevators, that were, quote, turning humans into a motor handicap. That there is, at the base of this, a kind of paranoia about mediation, not just at the level of what it does to a perception of space and time, but literally in terms of how it in a way occupies and colonizes the body. And I want to speak to a sense of why this understanding of disability in of itself is wrong. So quickly though, just for those who are less familiar with this, I just want to indicate that during this same period that Virilio was working, there's any number of other traditions within experimental architecture by which the speculative infrastructural, the speculative planetary infrastructure was composed in different ways. And also to the point about how usually things get built eventually one way or another. We see here Constantine Diodocus' Ecumenopolis, which in a strange way gets built as the cloud. I'm also noticed on this question of perspective and planetarity, this is a bit of is that it was this interesting moment in architectural pedagogy, perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, where in addition to the presentation of a project in plan section and elevation, we were treated to plan section, elevation, and satellite as primary perspectives by which a site and an interventionist site might be conceived. And indeed, the design and development of buildings, the faciality of a building, the face of a building shifting from elevation, its traditional, like the car grille of the face, to in fact what it looks like from 30,000 feet. And the impact of planetary scale sensing and occupation, rotating the face upward, turning architecture into a kind of geoglyph. Of course, all kinds of things that Virilio would not approve of. Now, I want then to, on this question of the prosthetics, and sort of locate this in a different arrangement of the body, particularly in relationship to disability. And then back to this question, to locate this architectural discussion back into this question of scalar disjunction and invariance that we spoke to about with the Eames. And how we might think of this not in terms of a kind of maintaining of bodily borders away from its prosthesis, but rather in these in cascades of different technologically mediated forms of disclosures and disenchantments. And again, this will, kind of a diagonal reading of Virilio's basic building blocks that I'm sure he wouldn't sort of approve on. Now, let's think, for example, then, take as our case study our generic figure here, that of the astronaut. Or in the US, it's astronauts. In Russia, it's cosmonauts. China, taikonauts. Black Sabbath has supernauts, I guess. So, The animal body, in which this pink putty of our brain is situated, is, of course, unable to leave its planet without bringing an artificial atmosphere with it as it toddles outward. The migration off planet is a long line, less of expanded settler colonialism than of the movement across and eventually out of the atmosphere. These astronauts and cosmonauts, all migrating waves of Africans now in orbit. There's at least a couple ways to read this figure. One is the sort of a kind of John Wayne hood ornament, the sort of like the singular individual puncturing the frontier in a most maximal place of possibility. The other is a kind of pathetic creature tethered to various umbilical prostheses, utterly dependent upon its little shell, without which it cannot possibly move. This is us, as you might surmise. This dependence on these umbilical arrangements to our mediation is not a kind of secondary or fallen status by which we occupy the world. It's in fact the basis by which we occupy the world. Without such mediations, we of course are just as doomed. We are, like this floating figure, all already in a way disabled. And this is also part of a kind of a basic notion within epistemology of disability studies, is the disability is kind of a relative kind of construction. And so it's also why Virilio's insistence against prosthesis as a sign of, quote, disability, and thus a kind of fallenness, is misguided even on its own terms. Disability studies demonstrates that it is not only a special condition of different bodies, but a general condition of disability that is all of us in our various dour entanglements with the world around us. Now, in his later work, this sort of the weird body politics of Virilio expands, amplifies into perhaps something more of a full-blown panic. Writing about biotechnology, he writes, biotechnology is intravenously released into the human race itself by the genetic bomb born of speed, computers, unquote. This total accident isn't just threatening humanity from the outside, an atomic meltdown of cosmic proportions, or in a global electronic storm. It is intravenously released into the human race by the genetic bomb. It is no longer possible to reinforce the body bunkers, concrete walls against attack. The enemy is already inside. This is, I think, a literally hysterical misunderstanding of what genetics even is. It is the moral panic of a creationist, which in many ways Virilio was. The assault on he goes on, the assault on the human race is too reminiscent of ethnogenocidal horrors for anyone to trust the neutrality of science or the global economic system. All right, I'm just going to leave it at this. Now, to the point, if the horizon is the spatial illusion of the world rendered for particularly an upright observing bipedal binocular vision ape, then different observations and perspectives are in fact needed. What we call the inverse uncanny valley. Uncanny valley, of course, when you see something that looks more or less human but not quite human, and in its not quite humanness, it rather creeps us out. We find it disturbing. The inverse uncanny valley is when we see ourselves through the eyes of this machinic other, and we're creeped out by ourselves, creeped out by what we see, not as what we expect ourselves to be, but in fact what we maybe are. And in this disjunction and alienation of this revelation from expectation is a different kind of uncanny from this alien perspective. And I would argue that such moments of demystifying confrontations with the latent image, as Sellars would put it, are not only psychologically instructive, they are crucial politically. As we were discussing this morning, our most important scientific discoveries usually involve getting outside of our intuitive view through some technically assisted alienation and extension. But many such moments, as we've been discussing, of this anxiety already come in a number of different ways. So the relation that we may have on a sort of everyday human-AI interaction, is what we'll be discussing in the seminar tomorrow, sometimes come from, as we try to figure out whether the thing that we're dealing with is actually a person or not a person. So rerunning these little everyday Turing tests sort of like a few times a day. Now, as I'll discuss in the seminar tomorrow, like most of these Turing tests, or all of them, it's based on a false dichotomy of kind of either or. The other thing is never simply human or not human. It's always an amalgamation. It's always a mixture. And this is sort of just the way it is. In these cascades, the world is remade and made and remade, not just by formal political decision, but by the dissolving of decision into automatic and prosthetic systems. Another way in which the political and the technological combine. The pervasiveness of automated machinery, both in reality and in projective discourse, demonstrates not that animated machines are clearly separate from humans, but that their entanglement of mutual prostheticization between them, operating in diverse and various ratios and asymmetrical distributed agencies and counteragencies, is the norm. baseline, always has been. California, however, is trying to legislate against this reality with a law that would require online bots to explain to users and disclose to users that they are bots before you interact with them. And given that so many bots are both a mix of code and real voice and real conversations, a kind of strange amalgamation at different levels within the stack, the ensuing explanations that these bots might need to provide may end up being rather more complex existential lessons than most users would want to bother with. They may also point to more Philip K. Dick-like questions about one's own status. And as you see here, of course, the more you have to answer the question, the less sure you are of the answer. All right. Now, the last sort of section here I want to discuss is on this notion of the question of planetary per se, in relationship to, particularly in relationship to the horizon, but also in relationship to its governability. So let me quote Elizabeth Delauthery on this question on planetary. She writes, "While environmentalists have tended to embrace the extraterrestrial vision of a vulnerable planet, philosophers have been wary of the, quote, second consciousness enabled by this Apollonian eye." She writes, "Famously, Martin Heidegger was disturbed by photographs of the Earth taken by satellite and argued that we don't need the atom bomb after all. The uprooting of human beings has already taken place," unquote. He concluded, "We have only purely technological conditions left. It is no longer an Earth on which human beings live today." And quote, "Of course, modern ways of imagining the Earth as a totality, including those claimed for militarism and globalization, derive from colonial histories and spatial enclosures." Yes, but, except actually no. The Earthrise image is, as we were discussing today, not just a text. It not only positions the figure of the planet in a framed perspective according to a fixed capturing gaze, it is also just what happens when you happen to point a light-sensitive medium at the planet from a distance and encode the imprint of its actualness. That is, planetarity exceeds and precedes perceptual position in ways that the global, the Mercator projection, for example, does not. So how do I mean? The planetary scale infrastructures by which we're sort of working are, of course, deeply dependent upon sensing in human perceptions and abstraction. There is not one planetary scale sensing and calculation infrastructure, but several, each directing a different present and bending it toward a different future according to different models, of which it is sense, indexed, stored, and transmitted. One of which, we'll speak to a sense, is Earth science itself, which begins really in the middle of the 20th century, begins to bend back and look back at the Earth in the 1970s, as we were discussing this morning. One of the accomplishments of the planetary scale sensing and indexing and modeling apparatus that we have wrapped the planet in, looking back with it, is the concept of climate change. That the very idea of climate change itself is an epistemological accomplishment of a sensing apparatus that produces the model that makes it so. So it's not just what would be the application of this apparatus to the mitigation of this problem. The fact the very notion of the problem itself is an accomplishment of this mediation. Another one of these, which we might compare it to, in this is the global financial system as a planetary scale indexing system. It identifies and enumerates and tabulates and defends and makes big bets on the store of value that exist in the world and as the world. And of course, its ontology and value is in certain dispute. The financial system, in this way, works not only as a medium for the circulation of value as construed, but it's a platform for the formulation of models of the present that inform models of the future on which predictive bets are made, models which in turn bend markets toward their rationales. It is, in the words of Donald Mackenzie, an engine, not a camera. Though perhaps better would be, it's an engine because it's a camera. How do I mean? It is an engine because it's a camera, because the accumulation of transactions made by and with abstracted units of value is sensed and indexed by the sprawling interfaces of the global financial media, ledgers and point of sales and statements and accounts and so on. That predictive models, because of this, the predictive models have the perceptual scope of data necessary to work. And because of those model media infrastructures, because these model media infrastructures are themselves read-write platforms, the model's steering influence can bend back onto those financial flows directly. It is recursive in this sense. And the recursivity of this event and its medium gives the models a seat of governance that is dependent on what it can see from there. Now, as mentioned, another mode of planetary scale sensing and calculation infrastructure is that of climate modeling and Earth system science, which has its own related history of sensing and indexing and storing and transmission media, and which also, through its models of the future, attempts, in a way, to be an engine because a camera, but far less successfully. The financial mode of planetary scale computation and ecological models of this as well have a different relationship to this potential recursivity. The two projects of planetary simulation are in real ways fighting it out for predominance, and literally everything is at stake. The quote vast machine of climate science, Paul Edwards' term, is really not only the planet so conceived. It's not just the vast machine, not just the planet as conceived by Earth science, but it is also the construction of the instrumental sensing media, suboceanic nerves, terrestrial epidermis, atmospherical orbital antenna, and more importantly, the amalgamation of both the planet and the apparatus, both vast machines, into a recursive rhythm of artificial feedback loops. So whereas the financial model senses trillions of entities and interactions according to instances of abstracted value, the climatic apparatus senses and construes a diverse range of physical facts and seeks to correlate interrelations between them. The latter is more difficult because molecular interactions at planetary scale are difficult to trace, and also because of their indifferent and unnegotiable reality presents a different standard that economic ontologies don't need to meet as they are parsing what is and isn't valuable. And also because its sensing media are not read-write in the same way that financial media are. Its models of the future are much more precise, but have less capacity to recursively act back upon the ecological events that they model. But they should. And I realize that this very premise would be an absolute nightmare for Virilio, but in important ways, this is exactly what we want. We want our climate models that demonstrate looming systemic risk to have the same capacity of granular level feedback onto the ecologies itself that financial models of risk have on the transaction that they observe and indirectly administer. I don't see this planetary polity, if that's even the right term, and actually I don't think polity even is, but I don't see this in terms of a, quote, biopolitical enclosure of a natural outside, unquote, but rather as the application of means of a future technologically mediated cognitive abstraction to predict the effects of fundamentally entangled forces of production and metabolism and mediation on how planetary systems can survive the fact of our sapient evolution. So, whereas Virilio, someone like Virilio, may see this as a capture of the molecular realm by a military supervision, and others perhaps as the subsumption of the climate model infrastructure to other economic logics of financial sensing and modeling apparatuses, I would actually want to articulate the inverse understanding of a relation between these models and modeling thusly. That is, as the subordination and inclusion of the financial model into and under the subordination and inclusion of the financial model into and under the climatic model. The subsumption of the financial model under the climatic model. Economics which models the abstraction of matter and interchange. All of these is a subdivision of ecology. Economics as a subdivision of ecology. In this way, we consider not only the media of Earth systems and how they can be made into recursive media through which future models of risk and collapse can enforce themselves onto the present, but also how climatic models use the media of a now internalized financial apparatus to steer the sensing and indexing and storing of value according to different definitions. And so, for planetary, some conclusions, and then we'll stop. Despite the integrity of mutual integration, planetarity cannot or should not be imagined as in opposition to plurality, especially as that latter term is now perhaps over-associated with the grounded and the local, the vernacular, and the unique experiences of historical pasts. That is, while we may look back, all of us, on separate pasts, these pasts which set our relations in the present, we will inhabit conjoined futures. That binding includes a kind of universal history, not one formulated by the local idioms of Europe or China or Russia or America, nor by a viewpoint collage of reified traditions and perspectives, but by the difficult coordination of a common planetary interior. Once more, it is not that planetary scale computation brought the disappearance of the outside. It helped reveal, again, that there never was an outside to begin with. So, Virilio's preoccupation with interruptions and obstacles, with the revealing character of the accident, still harks back to the strategies that he proposed as an architect. For Virilio's, the technologies move out of the realm of war and into everyday life simply means that war has become ubiquitous. But while technology is an accident, it is also disenchantment. It is not distorting a natural order, it is the revelation of an underlying condition. That is, and the point I'll end with that I've made often, in the sense that just as the invention of a new technology also creates a new kind of accident, the inverse is equally true. The accident invents a new technology. Thank you.